50 milligrams of 2C-iP, taken as soon as I get out of class, with 8 milligrams of ondansetron for the nausea. I decide I'm going to go by myself to run some errands on the other side of town. T plus 5 minutes. While waiting for the subway, I'm struck with a sharp pain in my stomach and lower abdomen. It passes after about a minute or so. T plus 30 minutes. After a long subway ride, I go to a grocery store that specializes in South Asian foods. While walking there from the subway, I feel some enhancement of thought processes and heightened music appreciation. No noticeable effects in the body or my senses yet. T plus 40 minutes. As I'm shopping around the grocery store, I'm hit with this wave of pulsing, burgeoning swiftness. Like suddenly my thoughts have accelerated. I find myself manically pacing the store, getting distracted and forgetting what I was there for. I can feel a bit of lightness in my body. I would call this the onset. T plus 1 hour. I'm feeling nice, very uplifted, both physically and emotionally. I decide to walk half of the way home instead of taking the subway. It's very cold out, but I'm substantially bundled up and can feel a great psychedelic warmth radiating from my core, thawing the frigid air from around my body. I'm thinking a great deal to myself while walking, heavily fantasizing about potential positive futures or other satisfying outcomes for my life. This reminds me of the sort of positive self-thought that comes from empathogens. I feel entirely enraptured in my own mind, almost unaware of the outside world, walking along mechanically and automatically, and completely ignoring all the other people I come upon. Visuals pick up slightly as light and indistinct patterns in the sky, flashing in rainbow colors, not much else though. T plus an hour and 30 minutes. I decide to take the subway the rest of the way home. Upon reaching the station and finally standing still, I realize how hard I'm tripping now. I feel physically uncomfortable due to the nervous stimulation and twitching in my limbs. Sitting still is nearly unbearable. I want to get up and pace, but I also feel very awkward being near all these other people. I feel so disassociated from them, and they all seem so alien. The visuals have made themselves very apparent now. They seem to have formed into all varieties of pulsing, concentric, circular shapes, interpersed with intricate tangled lacework patterns. All of the tiles on the floor of the station appear to have fracturing patterns on them. Overall, the visuals are very abstract and don't really seem to follow any sort of larger organization or symmetry. The subway comes and I take my seat. I'm anxious to get home the entire ride, shaking and hiding my face from people. T plus 2 hours. I arrive home. Walking around was scary. The high schools had just let out, so there were crowds of teenagers everywhere, and I had to walk through these crowds to get home. I normally have no issue with this, but pushing your way through a crowd of people while progressively tripping harder and harder on psychedelics can be jarring. While walking, it almost felt as though my body could not keep up with my mind, as if I had some projection in my mind of arriving home faster, but that projection went beyond my physical capabilities. I smoke a joint immediately upon arriving home. The nausea that was somewhat apparent the last time I took this has not been an issue, but I do notice some other painful abdominal cramps and a bit of twisting discomfort all throughout my body. I'm very wired and shaking very hard. I chew some gum to quell the jaw clenching. My thoughts are flowing quickly and efficiently, and I find myself spending a great deal of time just reading about whatever catches my interest on the internet. Similar to how many other psychedelics manifest for me, the open-eye visuals start picking up harder, while the closed-eye visuals are curiously relatively faint. With my eyes closed, there appear to be gray checkerboard diamonds radiating their patterns into infinity and pulsing in the ether. The open-eye visuals are like a tangled web of roots or mycelium, dancing and intertwining with itself across every surface, its form seemingly following some sort of mathematical or fractal patterning. They nestle themselves into formation while pulsing and flashing with waves of purple and teal. Soon my entire visual field is shaking, as if the world is coming apart at the atoms, as if these webs have woven their way deep into the fabric of existence and are slowly splitting it apart, like how water seeps into cracks and freezes to cleave over rocks. It is as though the world is screaming from being torn apart, but the fundamental deconstruction of all things has subdued this scream to a muffled shout. While I am very altered, it is still very grounded and lucid and functional in some sense. Perhaps my entire frame of reference has been shifted aside into some esoteric realm, and my grounded is objectively cast into some distant space. The visual circuitry that has been disseminating throughout my sensory field seems to crackle and sizzle, searing cancer into reality, belching out plumes of smoke from the charred fabric of every intertwined atom. The room appears foggy now. T plus 2 hours 40 minutes. I am very stimulated, not being able to sit still comfortably in any position for long, and shaking a great deal. I'm also sweating vigorously now. It feels like I have done so much in the past 40 minutes, and that time has slowed down around me. But in reality, I've just been reading a lot about World War I on the internet. Nonetheless, it does feel like I've taken in a great deal of information, more so than I would expect myself to in that span of time. The visuals now appear as radiating geometric patterns, still a degree of abstract and amorphous. They do not stand out as being particularly interesting or spectacular. This just feels like a very standard, energized, psychedelic experience. I physically feel very hot, and there is a burning sensation deep in my body that radiates through my veins like a poisoned fire, consuming a building, reducing it to a desert of toxic ash that billows up in great choking plumes at the slightest disturbance. T plus 4 hours 15 minutes. I've found myself very focused and able to read a great deal at once, only facing a small degree of the incapacitating distractibility that usually prevents me from reading. My friends have come over and are hanging out downstairs with my roommate, but I'm content to be holed up in my room, immersed in the steely blue fog of this drug. I've noticed at this point, I feel like I must urinate very frequently, though when I try to go, I find myself unable to. This eventually leads to my bladder feeling very sore and strained. This only progressively gets worse throughout the night. T plus 6 hours. I finally decide to go downstairs and join my friends. It looks like everything is foggy and smoky, and the air outside of the warm confines of my room chills me to the bone. Being in a well-lit space, surrounded by other people, is very disorienting. I thought I was mostly down, but the sudden immersion in a new environment makes me realize just how hard I'm still tripping. Conversation initially is awkward and difficult. However, as time goes on, I find myself more capable. It's similar to jumping into cold water and slowly acclimating to the temperature. I'm hearing and feeling this crackling sensation in my inner ears, especially when I'm talking or if I have my mouth open. This fades after about an hour, but is certainly novel and mysterious. T plus 10 hours. We've been hanging out and smoking weed for the past few hours. The open-eye visuals have been coming in waves, seemingly independent of when I smoke. They mostly appear as those labyrinth laceworks that swirl and twist and dance on any flat surface. I find myself much more able to do social interaction now. In fact, I find myself more able to than when I'm sober, a typical effect of psychedelics. We watched this absurd kung fu movie I picked up from a souvenir shop in Chinatown, with incomprehensible subtitles, an incoherent plot, and an absolutely absurd acting and visual effects. It's one of the most entertaining and baffling things I've ever seen, and the come down of this drug has certainly enhanced that. While the trip winds down, the urinary effects have only gotten worse. I find myself laden with chills and overall discomfort, but the bladder pain is certainly the worst aspect of it all. T plus 16 hours. I finally decide to go to bed. The cognitive and sensory effects of this drug have mostly worn off by now, but I'm still racked with physical disturbances. I still feel very stimulated, and no position I lie in feels comfortable. I'm shaking fiendishly. My abdomen aches. I still have to get up about every 20 minutes to pee. It's painful and uncomfortable, and the bladder aching still persists. This plane sucks now. After lying awake, tossing and turning for some unknown amount of time, I eventually fall asleep. Epilogue. The horrible physical symptoms continue into the next day. The same abdomen cramps, nausea, shaking, and urinary pain and urgency consist, showing no sign of letting up. I feel feverish and sweaty all day, and have a great deal of trouble regulating my temperature. This sucks a lot. I have almost no appetite and can barely eat all day. I give myself a heavy cocktail of sedatives around bedtime, so I don't have to toss and turn while suffering through this again. I do feel better the next day. Conclusion. This drug is okay at best. The last time I tried it at 30 milligrams, I barely had threshold effects, but the urinary symptoms presented in full force. At that time, I had been experiencing less acute versions of those symptoms for some time before the experience, so I was hesitant to blame the drug. This time, however, demonstrated that the drug was definitely responsible for exacerbating that state, and it seems it's quite capable of inducing those symptoms in me when they weren't already present. The headspace was interesting enough, but not particularly unique. I could get the same thing from other 2Cs without the horrible toxic effects on my body. The only part that stood out as pleasant was the come up before the body load really kicked in. The sensory effects weren't particularly interesting either, with only moderate and fairly abstract visuals. The whole trip felt like being seared by a cold, toxic fire. One thing to note is that both times I took this drug, I didn't feel like I was tripping very hard. But in retrospect, I realized how separated from my consciousness I really was. This one has a very long and very gradual come-up that immerses one into the experience so slowly that they may not even notice when it starts to really come on.